The bracelet sits in a glass case in a small museum in Delta, Colorado. It is not large. It is not ornate. It is a band of hammered copper no wider than a grown man's finger curved into a circle that would fit a woman's wrist, its surface marked by the irregular impressions of a hand hammer working against stone. The copper has oxidized over the decades into a deep reddish brown, the color of old blood or autumn creek water, and in certain light it catches a warmth that seems to come from inside the metal rather than from any source outside it. Beside the bracelet is a photograph, a tintype, the kind made in the 1890s, its image fixed in silver on a black lacquered plate that has survived more than a century without significant deterioration. The woman in the photograph is standing in front of a dark opening in a rock face. She is not young. Her hair is white and pinned back from a face that has been shaped by weather and work in time into something that has moved well past pretty and arrived at something more durable. Her shoulders are back. Her spine is straight. Her hands are at her sides, and on her left wrist, just visible below the sleeve of her coat, is the bracelet. She is not smiling. She is not performing anything for the camera. She is simply present with the absolute presence of a person who has spent years answering to nothing except the demands of her own survival and has arrived at a particular kind of stillness that most people never find. The card beneath the bracelet reads, "Copper bracelet handmade circa 1890. Marin Aldcott, Redwall Ridge, Colorado. Gift of the artist." That is all it says. It does not say what she left behind to make it. It does not say what she built in the dark before her hands were capable of making something beautiful. It does not say the name that one man refused to speak for the entirety of their acquaintance, or the name that a newspaper printed on its front page and that traveled from Denver to Kansas City to St. Louis, and once reportedly to a woman in New York who read it in a periodical and wrote a letter to Colorado addressed simply to Marin Alcott, Redwall Ridge, and received in return a copper button that she kept for the rest of her life. The story begins in the spring of 1889 on the morning that Marin Alcott lost everything she had spent 38 years building. She was 62 years old. She had been awake since before 4 in the morning, which was the time she had been rising since she was a young bride newly arrived on this property and learning its rhythms. The farm did not care how old you were or how tired you were or whether your knees had begun to register their objections to stairs. The farm required what it required at the hour it required it, and Marin had spent 38 years meeting those requirements with the consistency of a woman who understood that reliability was its own form of dignity. She had cooked the oatmeal. She had split the firewood, her axe finding the grain in each piece of pine with the automatic accuracy of decades of practice, the sound of it cracking across the yard in the early dark and returning from the barn wall as a faint echo. She had hauled water from the well. She had swept the kitchen floor. She had done all of it without being asked, without being thanked, without expecting either, because these were simply the conditions of the life she inhabited, and she had made her peace with those conditions long before this particular morning arrived. What she had not made peace with was the curtain. It hung in the front window of the parlor, pale blue cotton, with small white flowers along the hem. Her husband, Joseph, had made it himself 2 winters before he died, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, with a needle and thread, and the particular focused expression of a man attempting something outside his expertise who refuses to admit the difficulty of it. He had sewn it slowly and imperfectly, the stitches uneven in places, the hem not quite straight, and when he hung it in the window, it had pleased him in the disproportionate way that things please us when we have made them with our own hands rather than bought them. Marin had taken it down twice in the 18 months since his death and held it in her lap and then put it back. She did not press her face into it looking for his smell. She was 62 years old and not given to gestures like that. But she looked at it each morning when the early light came through, and she found in the looking a continuation of something she was not ready to relinquish. Bertie Alcott wanted her to wash it. Bertie was 44, the woman Clyde Alcott had brought into the house 6 months after Joseph's funeral, and Bertie's relationship to the objects of the previous household was the relationship of a woman conducting a very deliberate erasure. The furniture had been rearranged. The dishes Joseph's mother had used had been moved to a shelf too high to reach without a step stool. The quilt on the main bedroom bed, which Marin had made in her first year of marriage from the fabric of dresses she had worn as a girl, had become a decorative piece draped over a trunk, rather than a functional object on a sleeping surface. None of these things had been done with cruelty exactly. They had been done with the methodical thoroughness of a woman removing evidence. Evidence of a previous life. Evidence of a previous woman. Evidence that the household Bertie was now managing had been shaped by hands other than hers, and that those other hands had belonged to a person whose continued presence on the property was an inconvenience that had been permitted rather than invited. Marin had understood all of this. She was 62 years old, and she had spent 6 decades developing the particular intelligence that comes from watching people carefully and drawing accurate conclusions from what you observe. She understood Bertie. She did not blame Bertie precisely, though she did not like her either. What she understood was that Bertie's erasure project had a logic to it, and that logic was not personal. Bertie was simply doing what a certain kind of woman does when she inherits a domestic situation that contains, like an inconvenient piece of furniture, a person who was there before she arrived. Clyde was a different matter. Clyde Aldcott was 68 years old. Joseph's older brother, a man who had spent his life on the margins of other people's larger efforts, assisting, managing, supervising, always adjacent to the actual work without being its primary instrument. He had a way of standing in doorways rather than entering rooms, of occupying thresholds, of positioning himself between commitment and withdrawal, as though he had been born with a constitutional inability to arrive fully anywhere. In 38 years of proximity, Clyde Alcott had never once addressed Marin by her name. This was not something she had noticed consciously in the early years of her marriage. It was something that accumulated over decades, the way certain kinds of damage accumulate gradually and then suddenly revealing itself in full, only when you stop to measure what had happened. He called her she. He called her her. He said the woman or your wife when speaking to Joseph, and he said you when he needed to address Marin directly, and in 38 years the word Marin had never passed through his teeth in her presence. It was not an accident. Nothing Clyde did was accidental. It was a system, deliberate, inconsistent, a method of refusal that required more effort to maintain than simply saying a person's name, which was perhaps the point. Refusing to name something is a way of refusing to acknowledge its full existence. Clyde had been refusing Marin's full existence for 38 years, and he had become so practiced at it that the refusal had taken on the quality of a natural fact, like weather or geology, something that simply was and had always been. She had never confronted him about it, partly because confronting Clyde about anything produced only a blank, rearranged face and a change of subject. Partly because Joseph had been alive, and Joseph's presence had filled the space that Clyde's refusal left empty. And you do not grieve a wound while the thing that heals it is still present. And partly because Marin had known, with the certainty of a woman who has learned to read the architecture of a situation before she walks into it, that the name was only a symptom. The disease was something older and more structural, something built into the way Clyde understood property, and inheritance, and the legal position of widows in the state of Colorado. She had known this was coming. She had not known the specific shape it would take. She had not known about the curtain. Bertie came into the kitchen on that April morning with the expression she wore when she had decided something and wanted it executed without discussion. She said that the front curtain needed washing. She said it in the tone of a woman giving an instruction to a member of her household staff, which was Marin understood exactly how Bertie thought of her. Marin's hand stopped on the table she was wiping. She looked at the window from where she stood, at the pale blue cotton with its uneven hem, at the small white flowers that Joseph had chosen from the fabric samples at the general store, with the same concentrated effort he brought to everything he did that he cared about. No, she said, not loudly, not with heat. A single syllable from a woman who had said yes to everything for 18 months and who had found in this one particular thing a line she could not step across. The curtain was the last object in this house that still held the shape of her husband's choosing. Washing it, handling it as a household item requiring maintenance rather than a thing requiring reverence, was a step she could not take. She did not explain this. She simply said the word. Bertie's face did not change. Her eyes narrowed fractionally, but her expression stayed composed, and that composure told Marin something important. Bertie had been expecting this. The curtain had been chosen precisely because it was the thing Marin could not agree to, and Bertie had been waiting for the refusal the way a person waits for a mechanism to complete its function. She called for Clyde. He came to the kitchen doorway. one foot on the kitchen floor, one foot in the hallway. His eyes moved to Bertie, to Marin, to the middle distance between them, and he said what he said with the flatness of a man delivering a decision that has been made well in advance of the moment of delivery. If you won't listen to her, then go. 5 words, no name in them. No acknowledgement of 38 years of shared proximity, of the cooking and the cleaning and the splitting and the hauling of the 6 decades of her life that had shaped this household into the thing it was before Bertie arrived to reshape it. Just the pronoun and the ultimatum delivered to the kitchen wall rather than to Marin's face, because Clyde had spent 38 years not looking directly at her, and he was not going to break that practice now. Marin stood at the kitchen table with the cloth still in her hand. She understood now the full shape of what had been built around her. The law of Colorado in 1889 did not permit a widow to retain contested marital property if a blood relative of the deceased husband was present and disputing the claim. Clyde knew this. He had known it since before Joseph was buried. The 6 months of apparent accommodation, of allowing Marin to remain, of letting Bertie conduct her gradual erasure project, had not been tolerance. They had been patience. The patience of a man waiting for a mechanism he had designed to complete its function. The curtain had been chosen. The moment had been constructed. The refusal had been anticipated. And there was nothing Marin could prove. The law was the law, and it was on his side, and the only thing she held in her hand was a damp cloth and 38 years of work that belonged legally to the man standing in the doorway showing her his profile. Before she reached the door, Bertie added one more sentence. She said it to Clyde, not to Marin, but she said it at a volume that was calibrated for overhearing, because the overhearing was the purpose. I cannot stand her looking at me with his eyes for one more day. Marin stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. The morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across Bertie's face, and in that light Marin saw that Bertie was not triumphant. She was relieved. And the relief was not simply about removing an inconvenient presence from a household. The relief was deeper and stranger than that. His eyes. Joseph's eyes. Marin had her husband's eyes, or close enough that a woman living in the shadow of his absence found the resemblance unbearable. And Clyde, standing on his threshold with his back to both of them, said nothing. His silence was not a defense of Marin, and not a rebuke of Bertie. His silence was the silence of a man who had known about this particular problem and had chosen not to look at it directly, because looking at things directly was not in his character. Marin did not ask for Joseph's curtain. She did ask for her coat. The brown wool coat she had worn through 30 winters, the one that still fit because she was built the way she had always been built, and had not softened into a different shape in old age. She was told that everything in the house was Clyde's. She did not argue with this, because arguing with Clyde produced only the blank, rearranged face, and because the time for argument had been before this moment, not during it, and the moment had arrived before she had adequate preparation for it. She left with what she had come to this farm with 38 years earlier, almost nothing. A flour sack with 2 changes of clothes, the skinning knife from the kitchen drawer which she took without asking because she was 62 years old, and walking into uncertain terrain, and her need for the knife was more pressing than the legal nicety of its ownership. A box of matches, a ball of twine, and the tin pot with the dented rim and the handle worn smooth by 20 years of use, the pot that had sat on the back of the stove so long that Bertie had apparently ceased to see it as an object with any value, which was why it was the only thing of Marin's that had survived the previous 18 months of systematic removal. She walked out the front door into April morning. The sky was high and pale blue, the color it gets in Colorado in early spring when the light is clear and thin, and the air still carries the memory of snow. The road in front of her went 2 directions, downhill toward Cartwell, toward the post office, and the general store, and the church where Clyde sat in the 3rd pew with Bertie on his arm, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has discharged his obligations. Or uphill away from town, climbing through scrub oak and young aspen, toward Redwall Ridge, where the old Consolidated Ore Company had cut 3 horizontal tunnels into the mountainside before abandoning the operation 13 years ago, when the copper deposits proved insufficient for industrial extraction. She went uphill. She went up because down was Cartwell, and Cartwell was Clyde's world, and Clyde's world had just very clearly communicated its position on the matter of her continued existence within it. She went up because she was 62 years old, and the law was not on her side, and she had no money and no family and no property in her own name, and the list of things she could not do in her situation was so long that she had decided not to compile it. She went up because the alternative was to accept a definition of herself that she was not willing to accept, and because going up at least had the virtue of being a direction she had chosen. She reached the mine site in the middle of the afternoon. The Consolidated Ore Company had operated on Redwall Ridge from 1863 to 1876, 13 years of copper extraction that had produced 3 horizontal drift tunnels cut into the south face of the mountain, a headframe over a drowned vertical shaft, a collapsing crushing mill, and several surface buildings in various states of return to the mountain. The company had pulled out when an underground aquifer flooded the main shaft beyond the capacity of the pumps, and they had taken everything worth taking and left everything too heavy or too broken or too embedded to remove. The mountain had spent 13 years reclaiming what it could, timber graying and softening roofs, settling scrub vegetation, pushing through every available surface. But the stone remained as stone always remains, indifferent to the passage of human enterprise above it. Myron stood at the entrance to drift number 1, 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall, framed with Douglas fir timbers the color of old bone. Beyond the frame, a darkness so complete it seemed solid, a rectangle of absolute black in the weathered rock face of the mountain. She had no fear of it. This surprised her mildly when she noticed it. She would have expected fear, or at minimum the particular reluctance that a reasonable person feels before walking into a space that promises absolute darkness and enclosed rock, and the total absence of other human beings. But what she felt was not fear. It was recognition. The entrance to the tunnel looked exactly like what it was, a place where the world outside could not reach, a space defined by the absence of everything that had just expelled her, and the absence of those things was not frightening. It was in its own way the first breath of clean air she had taken all day. She stepped inside. The drift ran straight into the mountain for 80 feet before intersecting a crosscut that ran perpendicular to it. The temperature dropped as she walked degree by degree from the April warmth outside into something steadier and older. The timber supports lining the walls were gray with age but solid to the touch, preserved by the dry mountain air. She could feel the stone around her the way you feel the presence of something very large and very patient when you are standing very close to it. At the end of the drift, she turned right. The crosscut led to a stope, a mined-out chamber, where the ore had been removed, leaving a space 20 feet wide and 15 deep, with a ceiling high enough for her to stand without stooping. The temperature held constant at a degree she could not measure, but her body registered as cool without being cold, the temperature of deep earth, stable and unwavering, regardless of what was happening to the air above. She struck a match. The walls lit up. Marin had not known what malachite looked like in firelight. She had known the word in the abstract way, you know, words for things you have never seen directly, and she had a general understanding that it was a green copper mineral, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it at close range. The walls of the stope were laced with veins of it, malachite green and azurite blue, running through the gray schist in patterns that the match flame caught and scattered into points of color that jumped as her hand moved. It was beautiful. She had not expected to find anything beautiful today. She had not been looking for beauty. Beauty was not on the list of things she needed in order to survive the next 24 hours, and yet here it was offered without conditions by the walls of an abandoned copper mine on a mountain where no one had any reason to expect it. The match burned to her fingers. The dark returned. She stood in it for a long moment, the smell of the sulfur match fading into the cool mineral air of the chamber, and she listened to the sounds of the mountain. Water somewhere deep in the rock, a drip steady and metronomic. The tiny pops and ticks of geological adjustment, the sounds of stone moving against stone, on a timescale that made human lifetimes appear and vanish like matches struck in the dark. She laid her bedroll on the flat section of floor near the back wall. She built a fire ring from the loose rock scattered around the base of the stope walls, fitting the stones together with the practical economy of someone who has done similar things before and understands that the quality of the work determines the quality of the outcome, regardless of the circumstances in which it is performed. She ate from the provisions she had carried up the mountain and sat in the firelight and looked at the walls and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to peace she had felt in 18 months. And then in the dark, well after the fire had burned low, in a space where no one would see and no one would know, and no one would interpret the evidence as weakness, Maren Alcott cried. She had not cried since Joseph died. She had stood at his grave with a dry face because the people of Cartwell were watching, and the people of Cartwell had very specific ideas about what a widow's composure communicated about her character, and Maren had been managing other people's perceptions of her character for 62 years and was not going to stop at a graveside. She had sat across from Clyde's lawyer with a dry face. She had listened to the explanation of her legal position with a dry face. She had packed her flour sack with a dry face, but here in the stope on Redwall Ridge, in the dark that was so complete it had weight in a place where the nearest other human being was several miles away and moving in the wrong direction, she let go. She cried not because she was afraid. She cried because for the first time since Joseph died, she was somewhere that demanded nothing from her. Somewhere that had no opinion about her composure, no investment in her performance, no use for the mask she had been wearing since the morning of the funeral. She was alone in a way she had never been alone before, absolutely and completely alone. And the aloneness was not punishment. It was relief. It was the first honest thing that had happened to her since her husband stopped breathing. The crying lasted until it was finished. She sat up in the dark and struck another match and watched the malachite catch the flame, those threads and points of green and blue against the gray stone walls, and the colors were beautiful. She looked at them the same way she had looked at the curtain in the morning light, with the attention of someone registering a thing that belongs to them, a thing that requires only witness and not maintenance, not cleaning or management, or the subordination of her own presence to its requirements. The match burned out. She lay back down. She did not sleep immediately, but she rested, and resting in a place where no one could reach her was close enough. The first 2 weeks were the work of survival reduced to its right essentials. She built a cook fire at the drift entrance where the smoke could escape into the open air. She set snares on the game trails she found on the lower slopes, wire loops positioned with the knowledge of someone who has watched animals long enough to understand their habits. She brought water from the creek that ran below the mine site. She found what she could in the meadows above wild onions and early greens and the roots she had learned to identify in a childhood spent partially out of doors. She blocked the drift entrance from 6 feet to 3, stacking the waste rock that lay in piles across the mine yard, fitting salvaged planks into a doorframe. She braced with timber sections she set into the floor. She fashioned a handle from copper wire she found in the debris around the old head frame, threading it through a hole she burned in the plank with a heated nail. From outside, the entrance looked like a natural collapse. From inside, it was a door. A door changes everything. It is the line between a shelter and a home, between a place you are hiding and a place you have chosen, between a space that was already here and a space that is now yours. Maren had not had a door that was genuinely hers since she was a child in her parents' house. The farm had been Joseph's in the way that most things were his legally, structurally, by the arrangement of the world she had married into. She had made it hers through decades of work and care and the daily accumulation of a life. But the door and the deed and the fundamental legal fact of ownership had been his. This door she had built herself. The door had a handle she had twisted from wire she found on a mountainside, and a lock that consisted of a timber bar set into iron brackets she had bent from salvaged metal, and it kept out the weather and the wildlife and the eyes of anyone who might come up the mine road looking for a woman who Clyde Alcott had allowed to walk away without a coat. She was 3 weeks into this life when Orrin Fitch found her. He came on a Thursday morning, and she knew he was coming before she could see him because the mountain had taught her in 3 weeks to listen to the sounds of it, the way she had learned to listen to the farm, as a system with a baseline of normal noise from which any deviation was immediately apparent. The sound of a man climbing the mine road was different from the sound of wind in the scrub oak. She heard it from inside the stope, and she moved to the door, and she stood behind it with the knife held low against her thigh, and she waited. 3 knocks. Slow, not demanding, the kind of knock that identifies itself as a question rather than an announcement. She opened the door. The man on the other side was 76 years old, which she could assess within a year from the evidence of his face and hands, and the particular way a man of that age carries weight he has been carrying for decades. He was thin in the manner of someone whose body has been consuming itself slowly from the inside, and she could hear, even from 6 feet away, the quality of his breathing, the labor of it, the sound of lungs that had processed too much rock dust over too many decades and were operating now at a significantly reduced capacity. He held a rock hammer in his right hand. His eyes, when they found hers, held something she identified immediately from a lifetime of reading people curiosity. Not calculation, not recognition, not the particular flicker she had learned to watch for in the eyes of men who approached women alone in isolated places. Curiosity. Curiosity asks, calculation takes. She had learned the difference before she could have articulated the principle. His name was Orrin Fitch. He had spent 40 years working mines across Colorado and had been panning the creek below Redwall Ridge when he saw smoke rising from a fissure in the rock face where no smoke had risen in 13 years. He had climbed the mine road the way a man climbs who has been doing it all his life and whose legs know the gradient even when his lungs complain about it. He walked through the drift and into the stope and stopped. He turned slowly the way a person turns inside a space that demands attention. His eyes moved from the sleeping platform she had built from salvaged timber to the shelves she had wedged into natural cracks in the rock face to the stored provisions lined in careful rows to the fire pit, with its clean draw through the ceiling, fissure she had found in her second week and had immediately understood the value of. He looked at the copper wire handle on the door. He looked at the brackets she had bent for the locking bar. He looked at the way she had arranged the space with the instinct of someone who has thought carefully about function and found arrangements that serve it. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said there is a furnace in the assay office. The building on the south end of the yard, stone walls, collapsed roof. A crucible furnace fire brick still bolted to the workbench. The salvage crews left it because it weighs close to 200 pounds. Marin looked at him. These walls, he said, are malachite, green copper carbonate, the entire vein. If you know how to work the furnace, this mountain has more raw material in it than you could use in 20 years. She said nothing. He gave her what she needed to know about the furnace. The process, the temperature, the draft, the bellows, the crucible. He explained it the way a man explains a mechanical system to someone he has decided is capable of understanding it without condescension and without unnecessary simplification. He answered 2 questions she asked, and then he ran out of things she needed from him. She thanked him. She meant it. He left. She sat in the stope for a long time after the sound of his footsteps on the mine road had faded, looking at the walls that were laced with malachite, at the green and blue running through the gray stone in veins that had been here since before any human being had set foot on this mountain. She was 62 years old, with 2 changes of clothes and a tin pot and a knife and a box of matches. She had built a door and a sleeping platform and a system for storing food and a lock for the door, and she had done it in 3 weeks with salvaged materials and hands that remembered how to work even when the rest of her wanted to rest. The furnace was in a building 100 yards from her door. She knew nothing about smelting copper. She knew how to learn things. She had been learning things her entire life, and most of the important ones had been learned not from instruction, but from the accumulated evidence of trial and what follows trial when it fails, which is the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the body rather than in the mind, the kind that does not transfer through explanation, but only through doing. She was 62 years old and she had been expelled from her own life, and she was living inside a mountain with $2.38 in a dented tin pot. She walked across the mine yard to the assay office. She pushed open the door. Inside, bolted to a stone slab workbench with iron brackets that had rusted to the color of dried blood, sat a crucible furnace fire brick in iron, 18 inches on each side, with a bellows port and a flue and a small door in front that opened on a firing space just large enough for a clay crucible. She stood in front of it for a long time, her hands on her hips, studying it the way she had studied the drift entrance on her first afternoon, with the recognition of a practical fact that has implications she has not yet fully mapped. Then she went back to the stope and got the notebook she had found in the debris of the old cookhouse, the pages blank on one side and filled on the other with production figures from 1873 that meant nothing to her. She opened it to the first blank page. She began to make a list. What she knew, what she needed to learn, what she could do today with what she currently had. Outside, the April light was moving west across the mine yard, warming the stone surfaces, catching the glint of mineral traces in the waste rock piles. The mountain was doing what mountains do, which is nothing and everything simultaneously, holding its temperature and its silence and its geological patience against all the turbulence of what happens on and inside it. Marin Aldcott was 62 years old and she was not going anywhere. She was in fact just beginning. The furnace did not cooperate. This was the first thing Marin learned about smelting copper, that the process had opinions about how it wanted to be approached, and those opinions did not accommodate impatience or assumption, or the kind of confident improvisation that gets a person through most practical problems if they are willing to move fast and accept a certain amount of imprecision. The furnace required exactness. It required a specific sequence of conditions, each one dependent on the previous, each one capable of collapsing the entire attempt if it was wrong by even a small margin. She spent 3 days dismantling the furnace in the assay office and carrying it piece by piece across the mine yard and into the stope. 21 trips through the drift, each one carrying a single fire brick or a section of iron frame or a length of bellows pipe. The fire bricks weighed 8 pounds each, and there were 19 of them. Her back registered its objections clearly and consistently throughout this process, and she acknowledged them and continued. She was 62 years old, and her back had been registering objections to various activities for at least a decade, and she had developed a working relationship with those objections that consisted largely of listening to them and then doing the thing anyway. She rebuilt the furnace in the second chamber, the smaller stope connected to the main one by a narrow crosscut, positioning it near the natural fracture in the wall that she had identified in her first weeks as a source of ventilation. The fracture admitted a thin blade of daylight from the surface, and she had widened it carefully over several sessions with a salvaged mining pick, testing each stroke to make sure she was not compromising the structural integrity of the wall above. When she was finished, the crack threw a column of light 2 inches wide that moved slowly across the chamber floor as the sun crossed the sky, a sundial built into the mountain itself. The bellows she reconstructed from leather scraps and a wooden frame, working with an awl and heavy thread in the evenings. By firelight, the work slow and meticulous, her hands finding a rhythm that her eyes could barely track in the uncertain light. The crucible was cracked along one side. She packed the crack with a paste of wet ash and clay and let it cure for 2 days before she attempted to use it. The first attempt produced nothing useful. The temperature would not climb. The malachite she had chipped from the wall and loaded into the crucible hissed and popped and eventually went quiet without transforming into anything except a dark slag that sat at the bottom of the crucible like a reproach. She emptied it and started again. The second attempt was warmer, but not warm enough. The malachite softening but not liquefying the bellows port partially blocked with mineral dust that she had not thought to clear before beginning, and the rhythm she had found for pumping the bellows collapsing after 40 minutes when her shoulders gave out from the sustained effort. She sat on the floor of the second chamber with soot on her face and black under her fingernails, and nothing to show for 6 hours of work, and she looked at the furnace, and the furnace offered nothing in return. She opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote down what had gone wrong. The third attempt failed because the fuel was too wet. She had gathered it from timber piles that had been rained on 2 days earlier and had not allowed adequate curing time. She understood this in retrospect, which is the only way most understanding arrives too late to prevent the failure that produces it, but early enough to prevent the next one. She spent a week curing fuel on the warm stones near the main chamber fire pit. She cleaned the bellows port and lined it with a sleeve of native copper. She hammered flat from a piece she found in the waste piles. She repaired the crucible crack again with fresh paste, a second coat over the first, and let it cure for 3 days. The fourth attempt began well. The temperature climbed faster than any previous attempt. The malachite in the crucible began to change, hissing first and then going quiet in a different way, the quiet of transformation rather than resistance. She found a rhythm on the bellows that she could sustain a stroke every 2 seconds, steady and metronomic. And she held that rhythm for 30 minutes while the furnace roared in the enclosed space, and the sound of it filled the stope and bounced off the walls and came back to her from every direction at once. She was reaching for the crucible tongs when the crucible split. Not the old crack she had repaired. A new fault line running diagonal across the body of the crucible, and the split happened faster than she could react. A spray of material at 1100 degrees that crossed the space between the furnace and her left arm in less than a second. The pain was not a feeling. It was an event, a detonation of nerve endings from her wrist to her elbow, so immediate and so total that her vision went white at the edges, and she gripped the bellows handle with her right hand and held herself upright through the first 5 seconds by sheer mechanical stubbornness, while her body attempted to process what had just happened to it. She clamped her teeth on the collar of her jacket. She did not make a sound. Not because she was performing stoicism for anyone's benefit. There was no one to perform for. She did not cry out because she had learned something in the previous weeks about sound inside the mountain, that a sound produced in this space came back from the walls with a quality that told you exactly how alone you were inside it. And hearing the precise dimensions of her aloneness in the echo of her own cry was something she could not do. The burn was bad enough. The echo would have been worse. She treated it with cold water from the pot and strips of cloth torn from the hem of the shirt she had been wearing as a work layer. She sat with her arm pressed against the cool stone wall, the rock face that held its 54 degrees regardless of what was happening to the air inside it, and she let the cold of it draw some of the heat from the wound. She thought about Joseph, not about his face or his voice, or the specific quality of his presence that she missed with the dull, continuous ache of something missing that used to be so consistently there. You had stopped noticing it until it was gone. She thought about his hands, the way they had looked when he was making the curtain, large hands working a needle with the focused concentration of a man refusing to admit that this was not the kind of work his hands were built for. The way he had held the curtain up when he finished it, looking at the uneven hem with an expression that was slightly rueful, but mostly pleased because he had decided to make a thing, and he had made it, and it existed now where it had not existed before. She thought about what he would have said if he could have seen her sitting on the floor of a copper mine at 62 years old with a burn running from her wrist to her elbow and a failed crucible and 3 weeks of coal-black fingernails. He would have said, "Try again." Not with encouragement exactly. Joseph had not been an encouraging man in the conventional sense. He had been a practical man, and the most practical response to a failed attempt is another attempt informed by the failure, and he would have said, "Try again," the way he said most things matter-of-factly, as though the next step were obvious, and the only question was when she was going to take it. The burn scarred. A white ridge of tissue running from wrist to elbow on her left arm, raised and visible, the kind of mark that does not fade with time, but simply becomes part of the permanent record of a body's history. She did not cover it. She did not hide it. It was the price of the fourth attempt, and the fourth attempt had purchased information she needed for the fifth, and that was a reasonable transaction. The fifth attempt was different from the beginning. New crucible, smaller intact, found in the debris of the assay office behind a fallen shelf where the salvage crews had apparently not looked. Fuel cured for a full week. Bellows port clean and lined. A rhythm she had calibrated through 4 failures into something her body could hold, without conscious counting a breath every 2 strokes, a stroke every 2 seconds, the pace of a woman who has stopped fighting the process and started working with it. She pumped for 25 minutes. The furnace sound changed. She knew it before she could have articulated how she knew it, the way you know a weather change from the quality of the air before any visible sign of it appears. The sound shifted from the roar of forced heat into something that had a liquid quality underneath it, a sound beneath the sound. She opened the furnace door. She gripped the crucible with the tongs she had fashioned from a bent iron bar. She tilted it slowly over the flat stone she used as a work surface. Slag poured out first, dark glassy, the color of old iron. Everything that was not copper carried out by the reduction process and cast aside. She watched it pool and begin to solidify, and then beneath it rolling slowly across the stone, with a momentum that seemed to come from inside it, a bead of copper the size of a large marble. Orange, glowing, pure. It sat on the stone and pulsed with its own heat, cooling from orange toward red, toward the deeper reddish brown of solid metal, and the color of it in the gray chamber was so vivid and so warm that it looked like it belonged to a different world than the one it had come from. As though Marin had reached into the bones of the mountain and pulled out something the mountain had been keeping, something it had held in the dark for 10,000 years without knowing it was there. She picked it up with the tongs. She set it on the flat stone that served as an anvil. She struck it once with the rock hammer. The bead flattened into a disc, bright, smooth. She could see the reflection of the daylight column in its surface, warped and amber. She struck it again, thinner, and Marin laughed, a short sound rough from months of disuse coming out of her throat before she could shape it into anything more composed. A sound that did not know what it was, whether relief or defiance or simple surprise at the warmth of the thing in her hand, and so it was all of those things at once, unfinished and ungoverned and entirely genuine. It had been a long time since she had made a sound like that. She sat with the copper disc cooling in her palm, and she felt something she recognized as the specific satisfaction of a person who has learned something real, not from instruction, but from the accumulated experience of getting it wrong until wrong runs out and right arrives in its place. The disc weighed almost nothing. It was smaller than her palm. It had no practical application yet, and no commercial value in its current form, and yet holding it felt like holding something that mattered, because she had extracted it from the wall of a mountain by herself, with tools she had salvaged, and a process she had learned through failure, and a persistence that had cost her a scar she would carry for the rest of her life. She began collecting malachite systematically. She chipped it from the walls of both stopes, from the crosscut, from the drift itself, where the vein ran close to the surface. She learned to read the rock to distinguish the richer deposits from the marginal ones, to identify the azurite that ran alongside the malachite and could be processed similarly. She learned the specific weight of a good charge for the crucible, and the specific sound of a furnace running correctly, and the specific rhythm of the bellows that produced the temperature she needed without exhausting her before the process was complete. She made hooks for the stope walls. She made a ladle. She made a second small pot, imperfect but functional, with a handle she had shaped by feel in the heat of the forge. She made rivets for the bellows when the original stitching gave out. She made buttons flat and round with two punched holes, the kind that could replace worn fasteners on a coat or serve as small currency for a woman operating outside the conventional economy. And then one evening in late October, sitting at the work surface with a piece of copper she had been shaping, without a specific purpose in mind, she found herself making something she had not planned. A band of hammered copper no wider than her smallest finger, curved into a circle that fit her left wrist. She worked it for 2 hours, refining the curve, smoothing the surface with a flat stone, working the edges until they would not catch on fabric. When it was finished, she held it up in the daylight column and looked at it. There was no practical reason for it. It would not help her survive the winter. It would not contribute to any immediate necessity. It existed only because she had decided in the space of a single evening that it should exist, and that decision was the entire justification for it, complete and sufficient in itself. She put it on her left wrist, directly above the burn scar, and she did not take it off. Making something beautiful in a dark place, she understood, is the strongest argument available against the idea that staying alive is the same thing as living. She had been staying alive for 7 months. The bracelet was the first evidence that she was doing something more. It was Agnes Pruitt who found her on the mountain. Agnes was 64, a woman who had been running a cattle operation alone since her husband died 3 years earlier, and who had developed through that experience the particular directness of someone who has learned that extra words cost time she does not have. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, climbing the mine road on a gray horse that picked its way through the first dusting of snow, with the careful attention of an animal that has been ridden by a thoughtful person for many years. Marin heard the horse before she saw it. She moved to the door and stood behind it with the old reflexive caution of someone who has learned that unexpected visitors require assessment before welcome. Agnes stopped her horse at the entrance to the mine yard and looked at the south face of the mountain, at the fitted planks of the drift entrance, at the smoke rising from the fissure above it, and her expression was not surprise. It was confirmation. Marin opened the door. The two women looked at each other across 20 feet of mine yard. Agnes took in the bracelet, the scar above it, the coat that was clearly not adequate for the winter that was coming. "That tin pot," Agnes said. "I recognize it. Your husband's mother used that pot for 30 years before she gave it to Joseph, and I watched Joseph carry it home from his mother's house the week after she died. I would know that pot in a pile of 1,000 pots." Marin said nothing. "Come inside," Agnes said. "There is something you need to hear." They sat at the plank table in the main stope, the forge warming the air from the second chamber, the daylight column from the fissure tracking its slow path across the floor. Agnes drank the coffee Marin made without commenting on the copper cups or the copper hooks on the walls, or any of the evidence of 7 months of solitary construction surrounding her, because Agnes Pruitt was a woman who attended to what was urgent before what was interesting, and what was urgent was the news she had carried up the mountain. "Clyde told Cartwell you went to Denver," Agnes said, "last spring. That was the first lie. 2 months ago he filed a declaration of death with the county clerk." Fever, he said, Denver last summer. The stope was quiet. The forge ticked. The daylight column moved a fraction of an inch across the floor. Marin sat with both hands flat on the plank table and pressed her palms into the wood until the tips of her fingers went pale. She had known Clyde was capable of removing her. She had known it with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has spent decades reading a person's character from the evidence of their behavior. She had understood, on the morning she walked out of the farm, that she was not leaving. She was being disposed of. The disposal had been planned. The curtain had been the mechanism. What she had not known was that the disposal would include her legal existence, not just her departure from the property, her disappearance from the record. First Denver, a plausible story for a widow with no local connections and nowhere obvious to go. Then Fever, the death that closes the story and prevents anyone from wondering about her further. And then, once the waiting period was adequate to seem respectful, the collection of the marital assets that had been accumulating since the death of Joseph Aldcott, assets that passed to the surviving family member who had been legally designated as the estate executor. He had not simply taken the farm. He had taken her name from the living record of the county and replaced it with a notation in a register that would not be questioned by anyone who had no reason to look closely. "Why are you telling me this?" Marin asked, not with accusation, as a genuine question. Agnes Pruitt had not come up a mountain in November snow without a reason that went beyond neighborly duty. Agnes set down her cup. She looked at Marin with the directness of a woman who has decided to commit to something and is following through. Because Agnes said the Mountain Ore Company has filed for extraction rights on Redwall Ridge. And in the filing, the company's surveyor noted signs of unauthorized habitation in Drift Number 1. They will come to investigate in the spring. And if you are still here when they come, they will find a woman who the county believes is dead living inside a mine they intend to blast open for copper. Marin looked at the walls of the stope, at the green and blue of the malachite in the stone, at the copper hooks and the copper cups and the bracelet on her wrist. "Then I will not be dead when they come," she said. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has delivered what she came to deliver and found the recipient equal to it. Before she left, Agnes told her one more thing. Orrin Fitch had mentioned at the Cartwell General Store that he had visited the mine and found the drift occupied. He had not named her. He had said only that there was someone there, a woman working copper from the raw seam with a rebuilt furnace. This information had traveled from the general store to the church pew, to the post office counter, to the kitchen table of every household in a 12-mile radius, because that is how information travels in small western towns. And by the time it arrived at each destination, it had been augmented by the imagination of every person who had passed it along. By November, Marin Aldcott was variously described as a hermit, a prospector, a widow who had gone strange from grief, and a woman who had built something remarkable inside a mountain, depending on who was talking and what they needed the story to be. Orrin Fitch came the following week. He arrived on foot, which told her his lungs were worse, that the horse required more effort to manage than he currently had available, and that he had come anyway. She heard him on the mine road from inside the stope, the slow, deliberate progress of a man whose breathing was doing most of the work that his legs used to manage, and she had coffee ready when he knocked. He sat on the stool and looked at the walls with the attention he always gave to the chamber, the slow-turning assessment of someone who sees work and registers its cost in full. "The company knows," he said. She told him what Agnes had told her. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to rely on about Orrin Fitch, his ability to receive information completely before responding to it, his refusal to reach a conclusion before the evidence was finished arriving. He studied the bracelet on her wrist. He studied the scar above it. "You'll need a lawyer," he said. "I'll need money first," she said. He reached into his coat and put a leather pouch on the table. He had been selling her copper work in Montrose for 4 months without telling her what it had accumulated to. Buttons and hooks and hinges and the 2 bowls she had made in September when her technique had improved enough to attempt curved forms. The sum in the pouch was not large, but it was specific and it was real, and it represented the conversion of her labor into something the world outside the mountain recognized as value. She looked at the pouch. She looked at him. He said something then that he had not said before, something about his daughter, about the way Marin sometimes sat in a certain quality of stillness that reminded him of a person he had lost. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to finish it. She understood from the fragment what he meant, and she understood why he had come back every 2 weeks for 5 months. And she understood that the kindness he had shown her was real, and that its engine was grief, and that grief powering kindness is still kindness, but it is not the same as being seen. "I am not your daughter," she said. Her voice was level. The temperature of it was not. It was the voice of a woman who has spent 62 years existing in the margins of other people's definitions of her, and who will not at this late stage become someone else's ghost. He stood. He walked to the door. He left without finishing his coffee. The stove was the same size it had always been. It felt larger in a way that was not comfortable. The absence of a person who has been present regularly has a specific weight, and Orrin Fitch's absence weighed more than she had expected, which told her something about what his presence had meant that she had not previously allowed herself to measure. She worked the forge for the rest of the afternoon. She made 3 buttons and a set of hinges for a cabinet she was planning to build in the main chamber. She worked with the focused concentration of a woman who has chosen productivity over feeling, which is a choice available to anyone but which costs something each time it is made. He came back 2 weeks later. He put a book on the table. He sat on the stool. He looked at her and he said he knew she was not his daughter, and that was precisely why he had come back, because his daughter had not needed him. And Marin might, and the difference between those two conditions was the difference between a regret he carried and a responsibility he could still meet. She looked at the book. She picked it up. She did not tell him he was welcome. She did not apologize for what she had said. She simply picked up the book and held it, and the holding was its own communication, complete and sufficient. The winter that followed was the hardest season she had spent on the mountain and the most productive. The snow sealed the mine road in December, and the world above the ridge disappeared under white, and the chamber held its temperature, as it always held its temperature, constant and indifferent to what the Ozark air was doing on the other side of 100 feet of rock. She expanded the main chamber by 3 feet on the north wall, chipping at the soft limestone with the mining pick, testing each stroke, carrying the debris out in buckets to the drift entrance, where she stacked it against the wall. She strung copper wire between the 2 chambers and hung canvas curtains, dividing the underground into rooms that held their individual warmth. She built a sleeping platform from mine timber, raised off the floor, with the small improvements of someone who has been sleeping on the ground and understands from experience what the ground teaches you about elevation. She built shelves. She built a cabinet. She built a small table in the second chamber, specifically for the forge work, a surface at the right height for her arms positioned to catch the daylight column at the angle that gave her the most light for the detail work. She made things, not only useful things. She made a mirror frame from hammered copper sheet, the frame more ornate than anything she had made before, the border shaped into a pattern of leaves that emerged from the repeated hammer blows, as though they had always been in the metal waiting for a reason to appear. She had no mirror to put in it. She made it anyway and hung it on the wall, and the empty frame caught the forge light and held it, and that was enough. She made a set of small copper vessels graduated in size, each one slightly more refined than the previous, each one representing an increment of technique learned through the making of the one before. She made a cup for Agnes and a cup for Orrin and a cup for herself, each one distinctly shaped, each one marked with a small, impressed pattern of her own devising, not a signature exactly, but a characteristic, something that would be recognizable across pieces as the work of the same hands. She made the bracelet again. Different this time, wider, with a slightly more complex surface treatment, a pattern of small hammer marks arranged in a deliberate sequence that caught light differently from different angles. She gave the first one, the simple one, to Agnes. When Agnes came up the mountain in January with a coat that actually fit the weather and a block of salt pork and the directness of a woman who has decided that someone is worth the climb. Agnes looked at the bracelet for a long moment. She put it on without comment. She wore it when she left, and Marin watched her go down the mine road in the gray January light, the copper at her wrist catching a thin gleam from the overcast sky, and felt something she identified as satisfaction at a thing well made, finding a person worthy of it. The days of that winter were not easy, and they were not comfortable, and there were mornings when the cold that crept through the rock face despite the constant 54 degrees settled into her joints in ways that required significant negotiation before she could begin to work. There were evenings when the silence of the mountains settled into the chambers with a weight that had a particular quality, the weight of an absence rather than the weight of nothing, the specific gravity of the life she had been removed from pressing against the life she was building in its replacement. She wrote in the notebook on those evenings. She wrote down what she had made and what she had learned and what she intended to try. She wrote down the failures as carefully as the successes because the failures contained information, and information was the material from which everything else she was building was being made. She did not write down what she felt. What she felt was not the subject. What she felt was the fuel. Deputy Cress Sumner came to the mountain on a Thursday morning in early April. She heard the horse on the mine road, and she stood behind the door with the old, reflexive assessment, and she understood from the cadence of the approach that this was a single rider moving with the deliberate pace of someone on official business, not rushing, not hesitating, simply coming as someone comes when they have been sent. She opened the door before he knocked. He was 40 years old with a deputy's badge and the particular posture of a man who has spent significant time underground and carries the memory of it in his shoulders, a slight forward lean that is not a stoop, but the residual habit of a body that learned to navigate low ceilings and never entirely unlearned it. His breathing had the quality she recognized from Orrin Fitch, not as damaged, but as careful, the breathing of someone who has learned not to take it for granted. He stopped when he entered the main chamber. He turned slowly. She watched him look at the copper hooks on the wall, the shelves cut into the rock face, the graduated vessels on the work table, the brazier built into the floor with its clean draw through the ceiling fissure, the canvas curtains in the crosscut, the second chamber visible beyond them, with the forge and the daylight column, and the shelves of carefully preserved provisions. He was in there long enough to understand what he was looking at. Not a squatter's camp, not a temporary shelter. A home built by one person with hand tools and salvaged material over the course of more than a year, built with the competence and the care of someone who intended to be here and had designed everything accordingly. How long, he said. Going on 2 years, she said. He sat on the stool. He looked at the bracelet on her wrist, the scar above it. He did not ask her to leave. He asked her questions about the construction, specific questions, the questions of a man who understands what he is looking at and wants to understand it more completely. How she had rebuilt the furnace, how she had learned the draft for the bellows, how she had managed the winter water supply after the creek froze. She answered him directly and without embellishment because he was asking in the manner of someone who wanted information and not in the manner of someone building a case, and she had learned to read the difference. He sat for a long time after she finished. Then he said the Mountain Ore Company has filed a formal eviction petition. The county has 30 days to respond. He would be writing a report. He said this looking at the copper on the walls at the daylight column, tracking its slow diagonal across the floor of the second chamber, at the book on the sleeping platform, with a piece of copper wire marking the page she had last read. He said he would write that further review was needed before action could be taken. She understood what that meant. He could slow the machinery. He could not stop it. A deputy writes reports and a county processes them, and the law is the law regardless of what a man with a former miner's understanding of labor thinks about who deserves to occupy a given space. "Thank you," she said. He stood. He put his hat on. He looked at her one more time with the look of a man making a final assessment that will inform something he intends to do when he leaves. "You'll want a lawyer," he said. "Everyone keeps saying that," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. He left. Marin stood at the door and watched him ride down the mine road until the scrub oak closed around the path and the sound of the hooves faded into the general silence of the mountain. Then she went inside and sat at the work table and looked at the pouch of money that Orrin's sales had accumulated and the additional amount that Agnes had brought from the Montrose market, where she had sold 3 of Marin's bowls without being asked and had reported back with the prices in the buyer's exact words, which were that they had never held anything like them. She opened the notebook. She wrote down what she had. She wrote down what she needed. She wrote down the name that Orrin had mentioned in passing during his last visit, a lawyer in Montrose named Harwick Kane, who took cases that the larger firms turned away. She wrote down the argument as she understood it. The mine had been abandoned for 13 years. The company's extraction rights had lapsed under territorial statute. The land was public. She had occupied it continuously and improved it substantially for nearly 2 years. There was a provision in Colorado homestead law that addressed exactly this circumstance imperfectly and without guarantees, but it existed and it was applicable and it was hers to use. She was 62 years old and a county clerk somewhere in Cartwell had a piece of paper that said she was dead. She was not dead. She was going to need everyone to understand that clearly. Outside, the April light was moving across the mine yard, the way it had been moving across it since before anyone had cut a drift into this mountain, warming the waste rock piles, catching the mineral traces in the stone, indifferent, inconsistent, and very old. The bracelet on her wrist caught the light through the open door and threw a small amber point against the opposite wall of the stove. Maren Alcott looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, put on her coat, and began the walk down to Cartwell. Harwick Kane's office was on the second floor of a building in Montrose that had been a hardware store before it was a law office and still smelled faintly of linseed oil and iron filings, as though the previous tenants had left something of themselves in the walls that no amount of subsequent occupation could fully displace. He was a small man, compact and precise, with round spectacles and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades listening to stories that most other professionals would have declined to hear. He took cases that larger firms turned away. This was not charity, it was strategy. The cases that larger firms turned away were frequently the cases where the law was being asked to do something it had not been designed to do, and those cases, when they resolved correctly, left marks on the record that more conventional victories did not. Orrin had carried the leather pouch to this office. Maren had not come herself, not yet, because Maren was still legally dead in the county of her residence, and appearing in a lawyer's office while dead created complications that Kane would need to think through before she walked into a courtroom. Kane had listened to the full account. He had examined the copper goods in the pouch, turning a bowl in his hands under the window light, his thumb moving across the hammer marks the way a person touches something they are trying to understand through contact rather than observation. She made these in the mine, Orrin said, with a rebuilt furnace and a stone anvil. By herself, Kane said. It was not entirely a question. Kane took the case. The argument, as he explained it to Maren when she came down the mountain for their first meeting, rested on three foundations. The first was the expiration of the Consolidated Ore Company's extraction rights in 1883 under Colorado territorial statute requiring active operation or documented renewal, neither of which had occurred. The second was the status of the land as public domain in the absence of a valid claim which opened the door to homestead provisions. The third, and the one Kane considered most significant, was the fraud. Clyde Alcott had filed a false declaration of death for a living person in order to collect assets that were not legally his to collect. This was not a civil matter requiring interpretation. It was a criminal act that had been committed with documentation processed by a county clerk and recorded in a public register. The paper trail was complete and clear, and it pointed in one direction without ambiguity. The county has a clerk who processed that declaration, Kane said. The clerk will have records. The records will show the date in the filing party, in the stated cause and location of death. He paused. None of those details will be difficult to disprove, given that you are sitting in my office. The hearing was scheduled for the 14th of June, 1892 in the county courthouse in Cartwell. Maren spent the weeks before it working the forge. She worked with the focused regularity of someone who has identified work as the one reliable antidote to the particular kind of dread that builds in the period before a consequential event. The dread that is not fear exactly, but the sustained awareness of something large, approaching something that will alter the conditions of your life regardless of which direction it goes. She could not control the outcome of the hearing. She could control the quality of the copper on her work surface, and she chose to put her attention there. She made a set of vessels, her most refined work to date, each one demonstrating a technique she had developed over 3 years of accumulated practice, the surface treatments more complex, the forms more assured, the evidence of her hand in the work, more confident and less apologetic than anything she had made in her first year. She was not making them for the hearing. She was making them because she was a woman who made things, and the making was not contingent on external circumstances having resolved themselves. Agnes came up the mountain 4 days before the hearing, and sat in the main chamber for 2 hours. And they talked about practical things, about the details of what would happen in the courtroom and the order in which events would occur, and what Marin should expect from the atmosphere of a public proceeding in a county where her story had been circulating for months in the form of a rumor that had outgrown its origin. People will come, Agnes said, not because they have a stake in the outcome, because the story has gotten ahead of itself and they want to see the original. What is the story they have, Marin asked. Agnes considered this. A woman who went into a mountain alone and built something the mountain didn't expect. She paused. It is a better story than most people live. They want to see the person it happened to. Marin looked at the walls of the chamber, at the 3 years of accumulated work that represented the evidence of the story Agnes was describing. Then they will, she said. The morning of the 14th of June was clear and warm, the kind of Colorado summer morning that makes the mountains visible from 30 miles away, each ridge defined against the blue sky with the sharpness of something cut rather than grown. Marin walked down the mine road in the wool coat Agnes had brought her the previous January, the bracelet on her left wrist, her hair pinned back the way she had worn it since she was a young woman, her spine carrying itself in the manner it had always carried itself, which was straight. She wore the scar without covering it. She had not covered it on any day since it formed, and she was not going to begin covering it for a county courthouse. The scar was not a disfigurement to be managed. It was information. It was the record of the fourth attempt written on her body in the permanent script of consequence, and the person reading it correctly would understand that the fifth attempt had succeeded and that the succession from failure to success was not luck but practice. The courtroom was on the second floor of the county building, a room with tall windows and wooden benches that had been built to hold 60 people and currently held more than that because the people of Caldwell County and several of the surrounding areas had arrived early enough to secure seats, and the ones who had not were standing along the walls. Marin walked in with Harwick, Kane, and Agnes. She did not look at the gallery. She walked to the front table and sat down and placed her hands flat on the wood in front of her and looked at the 3 county commissioners seated on the raised platform, and she waited with the quality of waiting that belongs to someone who has spent 3 years alone in a mountain learning that waiting and working are not opposites. Harrison Mott, the Mountain Ore Company's attorney, sat at the opposing table with a stack of documents that represented the organized weight of a company whose resources exceeded Marin's by an order that was not worth calculating. He was thin and deliberate, a man who used language the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with the minimum necessary force applied at the precise location required. He presented the company's case with efficient clarity. The mine was mineral claim property. The occupant was unauthorized. Her improvements, whatever their nature, did not constitute legal standing. The company's application for new extraction rights was pending. Her presence impeded their survey work and their legal right to access the property. He requested immediate removal. Kane presented Marin's case. He walked the commissioners through the timeline with the methodical patience of a man who has organized his argument on the understanding that his audience needs to see the shape of it before they can evaluate its individual components. The closure in 1876, the lapse of extraction rights in 1883, the 7-year gap between the lapse and Marin's arrival during which the land had been public domain, her continuous occupation beginning in April of 1889, her improvements which he described in specific detail, the rebuilt furnace, the expanded chambers, the water system, the cultivated production of copper goods sold commercially across the western slope, her established trade documented by Orrin's sales records and Agnes's market transactions representing a commercial operation conducted from the site for 2 years. He cited the homestead provisions. He cited the precedent. He was precise and unhurried and entirely serious. The commissioners looked at the documents. They looked at Mott. They looked at Marin. The proceeding had the quality of something that was going to end in competing legal technicalities, each one requiring interpretation, each one sending the question to a higher authority for resolution, each one extending the uncertainty while the machinery of institutional process continued turning at its own pace. Then Agnes Pruitt stood up. She stood from the third row with the unhurried decisiveness of a woman who has made a decision and is following through on it before the moment closes. She was 64 years old and a cattle rancher who had run 200 acres alone for 3 years, and she had the bearing of someone for whom standing up in a room full of people presented no particular difficulty. She asked to address the panel. Mott objected on procedural grounds. The head commissioner looked at Agnes, who was already standing with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that they are going to remain standing, regardless of what anyone in the room decides about the rules, and he overruled the objection. Agnes spoke for less than 5 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use more words than the information required. She told the commissioners that Clyde Alcott had filed a false declaration of death for Marin Alcott in the late autumn of 1889. She provided the date. She named the county clerk who had processed it. She stated the cause and location of death as listed in the filing. She identified by name the person to whom Bertie Alcott had spoken at the First Methodist Church of Cartwell about the settling of the marital estate. She did not speculate about motivation. She presented facts. The facts presented their own argument without assistance. The courtroom was absolutely still. 60 people holding in their breath at the same time produces a silence with a pulse to it, a silence that is not empty, but full-packed with the suspended response of everyone in the room processing information and arriving at the same place by slightly different routes. And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Bertie Alcott walked in. She came alone. Clyde was not with her. She stood for a moment at the back of the room while 60 heads rotated in her direction with the unanimity of a response to something unexpected, and then she moved down the center aisle to a seat in the middle of the gallery, and she sat down. Marin turned. The two women looked at each other across 30 feet of courtroom floor and the accumulated weight of 3 years and everything that had happened in them. Bertie was thinner than Marin remembered. The composed certainty that had armored her in the farmhouse kitchen had been replaced by something that occupied the difficult territory between courage and shame. The expression of a woman who has made a decision that will cost her something significant and has made it anyway. Bertie asked to speak. The commissioners, who had by this point set aside any pretense of strict procedural formality in recognition of the fact that the proceeding had moved beyond anything their procedural guidelines had anticipated, allowed it. She did not defend Clyde. She spoke about herself, about the calculations she had made when she married a man who had a house and land, and the appearance of stability, about the arithmetic of a woman who had watched her own mother work a failing property alone and had decided at an early age that she would not repeat that particular form of exhaustion. She said that she had wanted Marin removed from the household, not because Marin had done anything wrong, but because Marin's presence frightened her, and she named the fear precisely. The way Clyde sometimes looked at Marin, not often, not obviously, but with a quality that was not the way a man looks at a woman in the category of family obligation. And Marin had her husband's face, or enough of it, that a woman living in the shadow of that absence found the resemblance a daily source of a discomfort she could not name directly to herself and could only address obliquely by removing its cause. She said she had pushed Clyde to act. She said she had not known about the false declaration of death. She said that when she learned of it, she had not spoken, because speaking carried a price she had been unwilling to pay, and that she had weighed that price against the silence every morning for 2 years, before arriving at this morning when the weight of the silence had finally exceeded the weight of the consequence. I was wrong, she said. An apology is not sufficient, but I can offer the truth, and the truth is that I was wrong. She looked at Marin when she said it. She held the look. Marin looked back at her. She did not speak. She did not arrange her face into forgiveness or accusation. She nodded once, a small, deliberate movement of the head that said, I hear you and I see what this cost you, and I will not pretend it repairs what was broken, but I see you. That was the full extent of what she had to offer, and it was honest, and she gave it completely. The room turned. 60 people turned toward the back of the courtroom, drawn by the collective instinct that understands when a significant player has not yet made their appearance in a scene that requires them. Clyde Alcott was sitting in the last row. He had been there through Agnes's testimony, through Bertie's testimony, through the systematic public dismantling of the account. He had spent 3 years maintaining the account in which his wife's widow had departed for Denver of her own choosing and died there of a fever tidily and without complications, leaving behind an estate that could be settled and a property that could be managed without the inconvenience of her continued existence. He sat with his hat in his lap and his hands on the brim, and his face carrying the expression she had known for 38 years, the flat, unrevealing arrangement of a man who has organized his face against the possibility of being read. But the flatness was different now. Before it had been the composure of a man executing a plan. Now it was the blankness of a man whose plan had been taken apart in front of him piece by piece and who was discovering that there was nothing behind it. He stood up. The room waited. Marin turned in her chair and looked at him across 60 feet of courtroom and 38 years of the particular silence he had maintained toward her, the silence of a name never spoken, the silence of a woman's existence acknowledged only through the pronoun and never through the word, the silence that had accumulated over decades into something she had stopped expecting to end. She waited for one thing, one word, her name, Marin. A single syllable that cost nothing to produce and that he had declined to produce for 38 years and that she had long since stopped requiring, but that she found herself in this moment waiting with the specific quality of waiting that belongs to someone who has finally allowed themselves to want something they have pretended not to want. Clyde looked at her. For the first time in 38 years, he looked directly at her, not at the space beside her or the surface behind her or the middle distance that had been his preferred alternative to her face, but at her face, at the 62-year-old face of a woman who had been expelled from her own life and had built another one in its place, and who was sitting in a county courtroom waiting to see what he would do with his eyes now that they had finally found her. He looked at her for the length of time it takes to draw one breath. Then he turned away. He walked to the door of the courtroom. He put his hand on the handle. He opened it. He stepped through. He pulled it shut behind him with the soft precision of a man who manages even his exits with care, a small, controlled click in the silence of the room. The sound of that click was the loudest thing Marin had heard in 3 years. Not because it was large, because of what it contained. It contained 38 years of a name withheld. It contained the morning of the curtain and the 5 words delivered to a kitchen wall and the mechanism of a disposal conducted with methodical patience. It contained a declaration of death filed in a county office by a man who had found it easier to erase a person than to acknowledge her. It contained every year she had worked a farm that was not legally hers, and every season she had cooked and cleaned and hauled and split for a household that processed her labor without seeing it. It contained the drift entrance and the darkness and the furnace and the burn on her wrist and the copper disc on the stone anvil and the laugh that came out of her before she could shape it. All of that was in the sound of the door closing. And Clyde Alcott walked away from it, and it did not follow him because the story of what he had done was now in the public record of a county courthouse and would remain there regardless of what direction he walked. Marin turned back to the front of the room. She placed her hands flat on the table. She waited. The commissioners ruled that afternoon. They did not grant Marin ownership of the mine. What they granted was more specific and more durable than ownership. They denied the Mountain Ore Company's eviction petition, citing the unresolved status of the company's extraction rights application and the absence of any currently valid claim authorizing the removal of a continuous occupant from what was in the absence of that valid claim public land. They recommended that Marin file a formal homestead petition through the Territorial Land Office, which would initiate the process of establishing legal recognition of her occupation and improvement. Harwick Kane filed the homestead petition the following week. 3 months after the hearing, Harrison Mott withdrew the Mountain Ore Company's application for extraction rights. The legal costs were accumulating. The copper deposits on Redwall Ridge were marginal at industrial scale, which was what had caused the original company to abandon the site in 1876, and that geological fact had not changed in the intervening years. And the story of a mining company attempting to evict a 62-year-old woman from a home she had built with her own hands inside an abandoned mine was the kind of story that newspapers enjoyed and investors did not. Mott was a practical man. There were other mountains. 3 things happened after the hearing that Marin had not anticipated. The first was the money. Kane filed a fraud claim against Clyde Alcott for the wrongful collection of marital assets from an estate based on a false declaration of death. Clyde did not contest the claim. He paid through his attorney the amount transferred without communication, without a letter, without any acknowledgement beyond the fact of the payment itself, the way a man returns something he has taken, when the cost of keeping it exceeds the cost of returning it. Marin received the funds and sat with them on the plank table in the main chamber for a long time. They were not a large amount by any external measure. By the measure of a woman sitting inside a mountain with $40 in savings and a leather pouch of accumulated copper sales. They were significant. They represented the conversion of 3 years of erasure back into something the world recognized as value. The legal system performing a correction that did not undo what had been done, but acknowledged that it had been done and required accounting for. She did not spend them on comfort. She spent them on the tools. A 40-pound forged steel anvil, the kind that professional smiths used a real working surface rather than the flat stone she had been using for 3 years. A set of planishing hammers in 3 weights. Files punches a swage block for shaping compound curves. Tongs in 4 sizes. She carried them up the mine road herself 3 trips over 2 days, the weight of them in her hands, the weight of her father's money becoming through her hands, and her work her own legacy forward rather than backward. Each trip up the mountain with a new tool was a different kind of arrival than the one she had made in April of 1889 with a flour sack and a tin pot. That arrival had been a retreat. These arrivals were in advance. The distinction mattered to her, and she let it matter. The second thing was Bertie. 4 months after the hearing, Bertie Alcott left Cartwell on the morning stage to Grand Junction with 2 trunks and no forwarding address and no Clyde. The marriage had not survived the courtroom, or more precisely, it had not survived what the courtroom had made visible, which was the full accounting of what Clyde had done and the role Bertie had played in enabling it, and the fact that she had drawn that account into the light herself rather than waiting for it to be drawn by someone else. She wrote to Marin once a brief letter that contained no apology because she had already offered the only apology she had, and repeating it would have been performance rather than communication. She said she hoped that the work was going well. She said nothing about the curtain, and nothing about Joseph, and nothing about the morning in the kitchen because all of those things had already been said in the only form that mattered. Marin read the letter twice. She set it on the plank table beside the tin pot. She did not write back immediately because she needed to think about what she wanted to say that was honest, and not more than honest, that acknowledged without either absolving or extending the wound. She wrote back 3 weeks later. 4 sentences. She said the work was going well. She said the mountain was different in autumn than it was in any other season. She said she had made something recently that she thought Bertie might like to have if Bertie wanted to send an address. She signed it with her name. She did not know if Bertie ever received it. She never heard back. But she had written it and sent it, and the writing of it had clarified something about what she was willing to carry and what she was willing to set down. The third thing was Orrin. His lungs had been declining through the autumn of 1892, and his visits to the mountain had slowed from the regular rhythm of the previous 2 years into something less predictable, governed by the days when his body gave him sufficient latitude to make the climb. He came when he could. When he could not, he sent word through Agnes, and the word was always the same: he was reading, and he would come when the weather turned. He came to the mountain on a Thursday in late October of that year and riding a mule because the mule required less direction than a horse and left his attention available for the breathing. He tied the animal to the head frame post and walked into the drift with the pace of a man who has made a decision about where he is going to spend his remaining energy and has organized his body around that decision. He sat on the stool. Marin made coffee. They sat in the quiet of the main chamber, the forge warming the second chamber, the daylight column in its autumn position tracking across the floor at a lower angle than in summer, closer to the ground, as though the light itself was settling in for the cold. He reached into his coat and set his rock hammer on the plank table. He did not explain the gesture. He set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something where it belongs after a long time of carrying it somewhere else, and Marin understood the explanation without it being given. A prospector's hammer is his future. It is the physical extension of the belief that something valuable is waiting in the next creek, under the next rock face in the next mountain, that no one has yet examined with the right kind of attention. Setting it down is not surrender. It is the recognition that the search has been completed, not because the thing was found, but because the finding was never the actual point. The walking was the point, and the walking had brought him here to this chamber, to this stool, to this cup. He was not going to need the hammer anymore. He was done walking. "I know you are not Dora," he said. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about for a long time and has finally found the right moment to say simply, without construction around it. "I know you are not Dora. That is the reason I kept coming back. Because Dora did not need anyone, and you did not need anyone either, but you were here and you were alive. And the alive part mattered to me more than I knew how to say. Marin looked at him across the table. She understood the engine behind everything he had done, the fuel that had powered the kindness. She had understood it since the evening he had said his daughter's name, and she had told him she was not his daughter, and the understanding had not made her less grateful for what he had brought her, or less honest about the limits of what she could be to his grief. Both of those things had been true simultaneously, and she had held them both without resolving them, because some truths are not meant to be resolved. She poured more coffee into his cup. He looked at the hammer on the table. He looked at the copper hooks on the walls, the vessels on the work surface, the bracelet on her wrist. He looked at the tin pot on the shelf where it had sat since her first week in the mountain, the pot that had been her mother-in-law's and then Joseph's, and then the one object of value that had survived the erasure project because its value was not visible to anyone who had not already known it. He left when the light in the daylight column reached the far wall of the second chamber, which was the signal he had adopted in recent months for the end of a visit, the point at which the day's remaining light was sufficient for the descent but would not be sufficient for much longer. Marin walked him to the door of the drift. She did not say anything about his coming back. She understood from the way he walked, from the way he had set the hammer on the table, that the question of coming back was not the relevant question. The relevant question was whether what had been built between them in 2 years of fortnightly visits, in coffee, and the occasional book left on the plank table was sufficient to sustain itself across distance and reduce contact, and she believed it was because it had never depended on frequency. It had depended on honesty, and honesty does not require proximity to remain functional. He went down the mine road. She stood at the drift entrance and watched him go until the scrub oak closed around the path. Then she went inside and picked up the rock hammer from the table and set it on the stone ledge beside the tin pot. Two objects on a shelf, a pot worn smooth by decades of use, carried up a mountain by a woman who had nothing else to carry, and a hammer worn smooth by decades of use left behind by a man who had finally arrived somewhere. She went to the work table. She had an order to fill. Agnes had sold 3 of the graduated vessels at the Montrose market to a woman from Denver who was opening a shop and wanted to know if the maker could supply more. The letter requesting more had been addressed to Marin Aldcott, Redwall Ridge, Colorado, and the postmaster in Montrose had read the name aloud when sorting the mail, the way postmasters read names aloud as a fact of the day's business, unremarkable and routine. The name had traveled from the postmaster to the counter customers, to the street, to the church pew, to the kitchen table, as names in small western towns travel carried along by the ordinary machinery of community communication. A reporter from the Denver Republican came to the mountain in the spring of 1893. He was young with a notebook and the focused enthusiasm of someone who has been assigned a story he understands is genuinely interesting. He knocked on the drift door and was admitted, and he sat on orange stool and drank coffee from the copper cup and turned slowly in the chamber. The way everyone turned slowly in the chamber on their first time inside it, and he wrote a story that ran on the front page of his newspaper in May of that year, under a headline that Marin did not see until Agnes brought the paper up the mountain folded to the relevant page. The Copper Woman of Redwall Ridge. The story was reprinted in Colorado Springs and in Pueblo, and in a magazine published in Chicago, and from there the mail orders began. They came addressed to Marin Aldcott, Redwall Ridge, Colorado, and they came from Denver and Kansas City and St. Louis, and eventually from a woman in New York who read the magazine article and wanted copper buttons for a winter coat, and received them 8 weeks later with a small card that said, "Only made on Redwall Ridge, M. Aldcott." The orders came faster than she could fill them, and she did not hire anyone, and she did not expand the operation beyond what her hands could manage, because the quality of the work was the point of it, and quality requires the specific attention of the specific person doing it and cannot be replicated by adding more people doing something adjacent to the same thing. She filled each order as it came in the order it arrived, and if people waited, they waited. Clyde Alcott read the article in the Denver Republican. He must have. The paper circulated in Cartwell, and the story of his dead sister-in-law building a home inside a mountain and becoming known for her copper work across 3 states was not a story that a small town would allow a man to avoid. The story named her. It named her on the front page in type large enough to read across a room, and it described her work and her method. In the chamber she had built, in the furnace she had rebuilt, in the scar on her left wrist, in the bracelet above it. It named her in every paragraph. Marin, Marin Aldcott, the copper woman of Redwall Ridge. He read his sister-in-law's name in print, the name he had never spoken. And whatever he felt when he read it, he kept to himself because Clyde Aldcott was a man who had kept everything to himself his entire life, and the habit was too old to break for a newspaper, even one that had printed a name he had spent 38 years declining to say. He lived alone in the farmhouse after Bertie left. The curtain was still in the front window, Marin supposed, though she did not know for certain and did not inquire. She thought about it occasionally, the pale blue cotton with the small white flowers and the uneven hem, the last object she had refused to surrender, the refusal that had set everything in motion. She thought about it without regret and without particular feeling, the way you think about a mechanism that has served its function and can now be understood clearly in retrospect. Marin Alcott lived on Redwall Ridge for 8 years. She left in the autumn of 1897 when she was 69 years old, and she left not because the mountain had failed her, but because she was finished. The word finished meant something specific. It meant that she had arrived somewhere she had not known she was traveling toward, a place where the question of what she was capable of had been answered so completely that continuing to answer it felt redundant. She had come to the mountain with nothing, and she had built everything from the nothing, and the building was done, and the thing she had built was not the chambers or the forge or the inventory of copperwork that now extended across 3 states. The thing she had built was herself, the version of herself that was not contingent on anyone else's acknowledgement of her existence, that did not require a name spoken by a specific person to know what the name meant, that understood from 8 years of evidence that the only permission she had ever needed was her own. She carried the tin pot when she left. She carried the rock hammer and the bracelet and the notebook filled with 6 years of production records and observations and the accumulated knowledge of everything she had learned in the dark. She left the bone button she had found in the main chamber on her first night, set in a specific place on the stone shelf where she had found it, because it had been there before her, and it belonged to the history of the mountain rather than to her history within it. She locked the drift door behind her. She walked down the mine road in the October morning, the scrub oak turned gold around the path, the mountain holding its silence behind her, the way mountains hold everything without comment and without end. The homestead petition had been granted 2 years earlier, which meant the land on which the drift entrance stood was legally hers, protected by the territorial record from extraction or development, a protection that extended forward in time through provisions that her granddaughter would eventually formalize into a conservation easement in a different century, ensuring that the mountain would remain as it was, the drift entrance open to the sky, the chambers dark and constant at their 54 degrees, the malachite still running green through the gray schist walls. The bracelet is in the museum in Delta, Colorado. The tintype beside it shows a woman standing before a dark opening in a rock face. Her shoulders back, her spine straight, the bracelet visible below her sleeve, her face carrying the expression of someone who has come to rest after a long journey. Not because the journey was over, but because she had arrived at the understanding that she had always been capable of making it. She is not performing anything. She is not explaining herself. She is simply there in the way that things are there when they have been somewhere long enough to belong. The card beneath the bracelet names her Marin Alcott, the copper woman of Redwall Ridge, gift of the artist. One man refused to say that name for 38 years. He read it in a newspaper. He read it on a front page. He sat alone in a farmhouse and read the name of a woman he had tried to erase from the living record of a county, and the name was there on the page in the largest type the paper used, and there was nothing he could do about it because the name was out in the world now, in print and in post offices and in the conversations of people who had held her work in their hands and felt the hours in it and wanted to tell someone. Clyde Alcott died in 1904. He lived his last 12 years alone in the farmhouse. The silence inside it was not a silence he administered. It was a silence that administered him, the silence of a man who had spent a lifetime not saying things he could have said, and who discovered in the end that the unsaid things had not disappeared but had simply changed form, becoming the furniture of a room he could not leave. Marin outlived him by 11 years. She spent them in Montrose in a house with a proper forge in the back building and windows that looked west toward the mountains she could see clearly, on the days when the air was clean. She filled orders until her hands told her they were done. She corresponded with Agnes until Agnes died, and then she corresponded with Agnes's daughter. She wrote to Orrin until he passed in his boarding house in the spring of 1901, and the letter she wrote that week was the longest she wrote in all her years of correspondence, though she never showed it to anyone, and it was not among her papers when she died. She kept the tin pot on the kitchen shelf. She kept the rock hammer on the work table in the forge building. She kept the bracelet on her wrist. On quiet evenings when the light came in from the west and caught the copper in the particular way that evening, light in Colorado catches metal, she would look at the bracelet the way she had looked at the curtain in the morning window, with the attention of someone registering a thing that belongs to them, a thing that requires only witness. She had made it in a dark place for no reason except that making something beautiful in a dark place was the strongest argument she knew against the idea that surviving was the same as living. The argument held.